I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week, we're going to be looking at a 1981 epic of a film starring the ever-alluring and very interesting character of Warren Beatty, the actor and director of the film. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I look at a film that was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, starting from 1988 and working backwards and every year previously. And I look at a film that I've never even heard of or had recommended to me, or just isn't in the general film conversation. I give my thoughts on it, sort of general Oscar race history, where it was positioned at the time, what won Best Picture at that year, and then also trying to answer the question of why isn't it, does it hold up? Why has it been talked about and more recommended? You know, supposedly these were some of the best movies of the year according to the Academy, yet some other movies get talked about more. And what's the reason for that? We found there's always sort of different scenarios, but there are some more recurring themes as we're sort of going to the end of the 80s. I like to sort of go through the main Oscar history. So at the time, there was 5 nominees. One of them being Raiders of the Lost Ark, which, of course, everyone knows about, classic Steven Spielberg film. It is interesting to see that it did get nominated for Best Picture. You know, I think maybe a modern day example would be Mad Max Fury Road, but they still don't happen as often as maybe sort of, you know, big blockbusters don't get nominated as often as before. That's something I want to note. So that was a nomination, and I didn't want to do that because everyone knows Indiana Jones. Another one was On Golden Pond. This is one I also never heard of. And stars Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn. Both of them got to their best. The film ended up winning Best Actor and Best Actress, Best Lead Actor and Best Lead Actress for Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn, which is the first time. It's happened 7 times in Oscar history. This is one of them. Most of the time they sort of win the big 5, which is a common Oscar terminology in terms of winning screenplay, director, picture, and then lead actor and lead actress. Movies like It Happened One Night and Silence of the Lambs have won that such award. But this one's won at screenplay, lead actor, and lead actress. The film was based on a play, which was who Henry Fonda's daughter, Jane Fonda, bought the rights to, and there's sort of a familial aspect to it. So actually a surprising box office hit. It was interesting to learn a little bit more about this film. And then another one that was nominated was Chariots of Fire, which actually ended up winning Best Picture. So that was a really interesting year because this was kind of a surprise win because no one really knew what to think, because a lot of the awards precursors were unknown and sort of and split in a lot of ways, and then it ended up going to the sort of British surprise hit in Chariots of Fire. This is a film that actually has stayed in pop culture just because I think that score, this classic sort of Vangelis sort of theme that's been parodied so much. It really is a key moment of the film. A film that's been played on TV a lot. Definitely a film that I think people have heard of, if not at least have heard the score. So at least a part of it has been sort of maintained in the relevant film conversation, and I would argue the relevant pop culture conversation. But that was a year because Chariots of Fire won Best Original Screenplay. It really probably, people thought it was either going to go to On Golden Pond or Reds. Warren Beatty ended up winning for Best Director for Reds, but then Chariots of Fire won for Best Picture. Nowadays, that doesn't seem too uncommon, but back then, that was definitely more uncommon. A lot of times, the Best Director and the Best Picture almost always went hand in hand. So when Warren Beatty won that, people were like, oh, okay, it looks like it's going to be Reds. But then when Henry Fonda, and then Katharine Hepburn, and then the adapted screenplay all won pretty much late in the show, people thought that, oh no, it's On Golden Pond. You know, this is a great traditional sort of track. And then what happened was Chariots of Fire, with its adapted with its original screenplay, and then won Best Picture. So I think at the time, because they were tied for 3 before going to Best Picture. Reds had supporting actor, probably art direction, or is it cinematography? I don't know, but we'll say a technical award, and then Best Director, and then On Golden Pond had the 2 leads in screenplay, and Chariots of Fire must have had score, potentially supporting actor, probably not though, and then maybe an art director award, as well as Best Original Screenplay. So that was sort of an interesting year. So going back on it, you know, maybe if Reds won Best Picture, we'd be talking about it more, the way we do sort of Chariots of Fire, because giving it a Best Picture does give it some sort of notoriety. But then the other film that we haven't talked about is, the other nominee was Atlantic City, sort of a Canadian-French co-production starring Burt Lancaster. a film that I really haven't heard of. And if I'm being honest, if I really sort of stuck to the guidelines of the show, I probably would have gone with Atlantic City, because I had really never heard of it. And I haven't, Burt Lancaster's a star, but he's sort of definitely an older star, and not as, say, more prevalent as maybe a Warren Beatty or Henry Fonda or something like that. But I went with Reds ultimately at the end of the day, because unlike last week, I think this week gives me a little bit of choice, because I haven't heard too much about Reds. Warren Beatty's still an interesting figure, a person who has been once a very household name, but I think nowadays is less so. So we'll just transition into my thoughts there, because I want to talk about really Warren Beatty and his career, because he's a really fascinating guy. He's got a fascinating career arc, because he is almost an elusive actor in the way that his irregularity of his work. He was mostly known for acting in the 60s and the 70s, starring in movies like Bonnie and Clyde and Shampoo. And then the big thing that changed everything was Heaven Can Wait. He co-directed the film and then starred in it, and that was a big success. And he pretty much had sort of like a blank check afterwards. And he'd been wanting to do this film since the 60s, theoretically inspired by something like Dr. Zhivago very much, or Lawrence of Arabia. It's sort of big, grand epic. And, he wanted just to first direct it, and then maybe get into starring it later. But then he ended up doing both, which is sort of his passion. So he became the sort of creative force behind it. But it's really after this film that he has such a weird career arc, and he hasn't stayed in the popular culture, maybe because of his attitude towards the film industry. The same way, sort of like a Robert Redford, who was in the same sort of position, won an Oscar for Best Director for Ordinary People, was big in the 70s and 60s, but then continued to be a great actor throughout the 80s into the 90s, and now he's showing up in movies. He's recently supposedly retired with The Old Man and the Gun, but he's been showing up consistently in movies. Where Warren Beatty, get this, in the 80s, I believe only starred in, it must have been only 2 films, because it was Reds and then Ishtar. And then in the 90s, he starred in 4 films, and then in the 2000s, 1, and then in 2010s, a couple of years ago, he directed and starred in Rules Don't Apply, sort of long-awaited Howard Hughes adaptation. So, there's not really an actor who works less. 1 in 2010, that's a decade. 1 in the 2000s, 4 in the 90s, 2 in the 80s. He was prevalent in the 70s and 60s, but for some reason after this, it took a while to actually star in something, until it was Elaine May's 1987 sort of disaster, a movie you could say, Ishtar. And then he does come back and direct, but he never really gets the acclaim like he did with Reds. He's just a really interesting figure in the fact that when I look back on him, he doesn't show up in many movies today. So I know when I sort of learn more about, like, he was a big star at the time, but then I almost forget that he's still alive, because he's so inactive in a lot of his movies and a lot of his acting appearances and even his directing appearances. So he's a very strange figure. I guess he just doesn't need it anymore. And I'm not sure if he's super passionate about the art form. It's kind of hard to tell. But transitioning over to my thoughts of the film, what I think about Reds, kind of from a 2019 viewpoint, and I enjoyed the movie. There were some things that it gets put on the list of like best epics of all time many times. So I was very intrigued to see this movie. It clocks in about 3 hours and 20 minutes, I'd say. So it's a long movie, but in a lot of ways, maybe giving that epic consideration was a negative aspect to it, because I think the film does a good thing, but it also kind of hinders in a lot of ways. The film isn't sort of it's about this man, this journalist, who's a left-wing journalist, writing about and sort of was in Russia during the time of the Russian Revolution, after World War I, before World War II. That really shaped Western civilization for the next 50, 60 years. But the film, and he's a communist, but the film doesn't sort of sympathize with his ideology or really try to make you side either way. So that, in that sense, it's good, because it's not just sort of a propaganda piece. But unfortunately, the sort of politics then become kind of confusing. His sort of reason for doing things can become confusing in a lot of ways. The events that he's going to in the moment of his life and why he's in certain places are not that well explained. And this is an epic because it's long in length, I guess, because there's not sort of action sequences. There's not sort of him in sort of a middle of battle sequence. It's a lot of sort of political debating. But the problem is when you're not trying to sympathize with his politics, and I feel like the film almost does a poor job explaining those politics, and therefore I had a hard time understanding my surroundings and understanding where I was and why he was fighting, and that's sort of a key character motivation. However, what I really enjoyed about the movie, and I think these parts of the film that I enjoyed more, were the romantic parts. There's sort of a love triangle going on with Jack Nicholson in an incredible role, really sort of subtle, different supporting role from Jack Nicholson. At the height of his powers, he could have been doing, you know, a lead role, but he chose to do this in a really interesting part. Sort of a cynical playwright. Diane Keaton is brilliant, often going between sort of bubbly and sort of being sort of that typical domestic wife, but then sort of fighting those impulses because she didn't want to be here, but then sort of got stuck in here and sort of just riding sort of the crazy wave that is Jack Reed, Warren Beatty's character. And really, it's their true love story, despite all the interjections by Jack Nicholson's character and sort of the relationship between their friends and the multiple sort of New York and then Oregon and Russia and all these different sort of places. It's the sort of the decades-long sort of relationship, this constant sort of battle for love, where they know they're meant to be for each other, but it's hard to make it work in a lot of ways, and every time they try to make it work, you know, this is the time, it's going to work this time, and then there's always something that sort of falls apart with it, and it's a tragic kind of a romance, but it's still sort of a very sweeping sort of classic Hollywood romance, which I really appreciated with the performances by Warren Beatty, Diane Keaton, and Jack Nicholson across the board are really fantastic. You know, it's great seeing Diane Keaton not in sort of a Woody Allen fast-talking kind of movie, even though this has a lot of fast-talking and political debates and whatnot. But really, for me, what I gravitated towards was that romance aspect of the film. And then just answering, I guess, this final question now, summing it up, you know, why isn't this a film being talked about? I mean, it is kind of being talked about. I have heard about it a bit in terms of, you know, good epic movies, or, you know, Warren Beatty. You've heard about him at the very least, I think, as an actor who's popular, especially, you know, you start to explore Robert Altman films and whatnot. You know, Bonnie and Clyde, sort of a seminal film that started the wave of the sort of 70s filmmaking in a lot of ways, with Arthur Penn directed that. So he is an icon in Hollywood, but you think you have to explore him. I don't think he's a household name anymore. I don't think he's sort of known to a lot of people in this generation. I think, you know, he's a great actor, and I think if you're a film fan, you should explore his back catalog, because he has some interesting movies, and I think he's a good actor, and I think he's a good director with an interesting career. Just read a little bit more about him if this video didn't suffice, and learn a little bit more about his career choices and the way sort of he approached it, because I still don't really understand it completely either. I'm definitely going to check out more about him, but that was sort of just a brief synopsis, but also in the general sense, I think, you know, this movie didn't win Best Picture. It's from a star that no one really remembers anymore, unfortunately, at least because, you know, he's not doing movies today and whatnot, but also I think that, you know, the movie's kind of hard to recommend because of its runtime, 3 hours and 20 minutes. It's not an action movie. It's got a lot of political debates in a room, and the communists kind of sort of maybe put people off. Oh, I don't want to see a political movie. I don't want, like, politics in my entertainment. I know that's sort of an argument, silly as, you know, some people may think. I know that's sort of a prevalent argument in a lot of people, and I understand that in a lot of ways. But I think, you know, if you do want to sort of challenge yourself and see a film with some beautiful, you know, it's a beautifully shot film. It's not sort of grand sweeping the seas from something like Lawrence of Arabia or Dr. Zhivago is, but I still think that there's some really interesting political elements to it, but really you're here for the romance, and there's some great chemistry and some great performances from top tier actors. So if you're really interested in that, I think you should check it out. Stay tuned to next week. We're going to be doing the first Best Picture winner of the year, which is going to be Ordinary People, and then the week after that I plan on doing All That Jazz, because of a common recommendation. So please recommend some movies down below for future years, you know, 78, 77, you know, if you recommend Godfather for 72, I'm not going to cover it just because that film is not forgotten. But if there's some films that you really enjoy that maybe didn't win Best Picture or haven't been talked about a whole lot, I'll definitely consider them, that I haven't seen, of course, but please, you know, comment below. Please feel free to do all that kind of good stuff. That's about it, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and until next time, stay tuned.